We didn't get as far as we would have liked in our last lecture, so in this one we're going to pick up 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay, so in 1st and 2nd Kings, we start off with Solomon being king, and we see the kingdom still being united. Namely, God's people are represented by one kingdom. But starting in 1st Kings chapter 12, we see that the kingdom becomes divided. We'll talk about this. And then we see a final section with Judah's last kings and the exile, which is a term referring to God's people being removed from their homeland. Some major themes continue to be the dangers of idolatry. We see God's people failing to love God. There's a vertical problem, but then there's also a horizontal problem. God's people are not treating one another in truly human ways. We see the result of this is God's patience, but God's patience does come to an end with judgment. But even in Kings, we're seeing this promise of restoration. So where 1st and 2nd Samuel basically cover the reign of two kings, Saul and David, 1st and 2nd Kings serves as really it fast forwards through many generations. We're seeing 20 kings in the northern nation and 19 kings and actually a queen in Judah. We see that David chooses Solomon to be his successor. We see, again, trials with Adonijah, who tries to set himself up as the next king and who ends up dying because after he tries to rebel again. So again, all of this turmoil in the family because of David's sin himself. Solomon, this is really the height of the kingdom of Israel. He inherits a united monarchy. He inherits a mighty nation with many resources. And toward the end of David's life, he began to prepare for the building of the temple. He wanted to build the temple, but God wouldn't let him because he was a man of war. He said Solomon would do it. So David spent the end of his life getting resources for Solomon. So Solomon inherits all of this. And at the beginning of the story, of the narrative, we see that God asks Solomon, what do you want? And really beautifully, Solomon doesn't ask for riches or for prosperity, for security. He asks for wisdom. He says, give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern your great people? I mean, what a beautiful request. And you therefore have hopes. I mean, maybe God's people are going to flourish. Maybe that promise that they're going to be a blessing to the nations is going to become a reality. And it is a reality in the book of 1st Kings, at least in the beginning. We see the Queen of the South come and test Solomon's wisdom. We see Solomon's wisdom also being illustrated through hard cases like these two women. You know the story probably. One rolls over on her child at night and kills it. So she steals the other's child, and then there's this contention, and they go to Solomon, and Solomon will cut the baby in half and give each half. And the one says, no, let her have it. And Solomon knew that she was the mother and gives her the child. So do you see that Solomon's request for wisdom is now a blessing to this woman who almost lost her son? Like, we see that the nation is being blessed. And when they built the temple, one of the purposes of the temple in 1 Kings 6 is that the nations might come to the temple and might offer sacrifice and might come to know that the Lord is the true God. Notice throughout Israel's history, baked into who they are, is the desire for the nations to come and learn that the Lord is the true God. We saw that with the book of Exodus and the signs. We saw that with Rahab in the book of Joshua. And now we're seeing that with the temple. Um, Israel was supposed to be, in a sense, an evangelistic nation. Namely, they weren't just to be a nation that was say, "Oh, your God is your God and our God is our God." Like no, like they recognize that the Lord is the one and true God who deserved worship from all people. And the temple was constructed to be this evangelistic landmark where people can come and in a sense put the Lord to the test, offer sacrifices, and learn that He is the true and living God. And here is a picture of the temple. So go ahead and stop me now. Kind of blow up the picture. You'll see, the bronze altar. You'll see the cherubim, the holies of holies, the basins out front. So go ahead and stop me and take a look at this and notice that it's the building is starting around 966 and notice the dimensions of the building. Um, in some ways, it's like a normal temple, but in other ways, it's not because there's a few differences. On the one hand, at the center of ancient temples, you would find the image of that god, but at the center of this temple, you don't have an image of that god. You don't have an idol. Why? Because we are the image of God. So, what is at the center of this temple is the Ten Commandments. Think about that. At the center of the temple is the law. And that's significant because an idol in the ancient world was like manipulatable. So you made an idol and you prayed that God would inhabit it, and then basically you approached it and you were able to make sacrifices and maneuvering it so that you can guarantee divine blessings. Well, notice the pathway to divine blessings isn't through an idol that can be manipulated. It's through God's revealed word. So in some ways, like the size of the temple, an altar to sacrifice things, I mean, this was normal. But in other ways, this was distinct in that there was no idol, there were no images. Um, uh, this is a different kind of temple. A temple that's not based on manipulating the divine, but having a relationship with the divine. So things are looking pretty good. You can read here in 1 Kings chapter 9, and you could see Solomon's prayer that he is praying, and how he's asking for God to be present with his people. He's asking for him to be kind to his people. Even when God's people turn aside, he's asking that God would be merciful to his people. This is a prayer at the dedication of the temple, and things are looking pretty good. But just as with David, just as with Joshua, we see that when things are looking really good, our hopes are dashed. And what we're seeing with King Solomon is that his issue is he loved many foreign women. He had many, many wives, something that the king of God's people was not supposed to do. He wasn't supposed to have many wives. And he wasn't supposed to marry foreign women. And that's not an issue of like when we think of it, it's religious in this context, because in this context, if Solomon is to marry the daughter of Pharaoh, which he did, and the daughter of the king of Moab, like he did, then what he's doing is he is putting his faith in military alliances, and what he's doing is he's bringing other religions into Israel, and that's what he does. He makes idols for all of these foreign women and temples for all of these foreign women. This isn't an issue with interracial marriage. This is an issue with marrying people of a different religion. This is an issue with taking serious that Solomon's heart is being led astray. He is not being faithful to God. He is being faithless to God. He is living like the kings of this world. The kings in that context married a lot of wives because they had the power to do it. They had harems and they could do whatever they wanted with them, objectifying these women. And they did it not only for their pleasure, but they did it for military alliances. And that's exactly what Solomon's doing. And Here we're seeing tragedy happen because when God, the King of God's people, his heart is led astray, then the heart of the people is also led astray. Remember, the role of the King of God's people was to shepherd the people to God, and Solomon is doing the exact opposite. And this leads to the divided kingdom. Solomon dies in the midst of turmoil, and Rehoboam, his son, becomes king and is really, really foolish. So Solomon built a lot of projects. He infrastructure was looking good, but how did he do that? He did it a lot with forced labor. So and he had a lot of banquets. He was the king, so he took a lot of food from the people. So he took their time, he took their food, he took their labor, and the nation wasn't very happy with this. So when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, became king, the nation gathers together and they say, hey, listen, Solomon was really harsh with us. Please be more gentle with us. Like this is too much. And Rehoboam says, well, give me some time to think this over. So he talks to Solomon's advisors and they say, lighten their load. Be kind, speak to them gently, and they will serve you. And then Solomon turns to his peers, the people he went to grade school with. And he asks them what he should do. And he's like, you should be rough with them. Tell them that your thumb is bigger than your dad's thigh. And how your dad whipped him with whips, you're going to whip him with scorpions. And Rehoboam's like, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So he goes to the people and he's really harsh. And the people are like, well, we're done. Like, we ain't going to do it. And they rebel. They just stop. And God tells Rehoboam, this is from me. Like, don't go fight. And at this point, the nation is divided. So you basically have Judah, which is one of the tribes, and Benjamin, and then the Levites that are in the south. And then you have the other nations in the north. And the distribution of tribes isn't always the same. So sometimes you see like the 10 tribes and the 1 tribe or the 2 tribes. But basically you have Judah and Benjamin and the Levites who are following Rehoboam as their king. And then you have the other tribes in the north who anoint Jeroboam to be their king. Jeroboam is the rival to Rehoboam, and he becomes the king of the nation to the north. Jeroboam, God gives him a promise so similar to David, guys. He says, if you are faithful to me, I will give you a dynasty just like I'm giving David. And it's really sad because Jeroboam does not trust God. He's cut in the mold of Saul. So he's now king of the northern tribes, and he thinks to himself, if I am going to survive, then we have to change some things around here. Because remember, there were some laws that God gave his people, namely that people had to make 3 pilgrimages a year to Jerusalem. And they needed to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, which was in Judah. But now Jeroboam is like, but hey, we don't follow Jerusalem. That's where Rehoboam is reigning. So if I am faithful to God, and I let my people go 3 times a year down to Jerusalem and worship, then they might start thinking, hey, like we should let Rehoboam be king again, and then off with my head. So do you see the scary situation? So what does Jeroboam do? He anoints his own priests. He makes his own gods, and he makes his own places of worship. The one in the north is Dan. The one in the south is Bethel, the most northern and southern part of his nation. He constructs golden calves, which reminds you of Aaron, right? And he says, these are the gods who brought you out of Egypt, to worship these at Dan and Bethel. So he constitutes a completely new religion, because in his wisdom, he believed faithfulness to God would mean his death, even though God told him faithfulness to me would mean your life. And what do you think God did with this? He judged Jeroboam. And really sadly, in just a generation, his entire family is wiped out. And again, an illustration that the sin of a father and a mother affects their family. So Jeroboam walks by sight, just like Saul, not by faith. Here is a picture of roughly what we're seeing. So this is the northern nation that Jeroboam is reigning over. Here is the southern nation that Rehoboam is reigning over. Here is, if we were to look at First Kings, here would be the kings who reigned over Israel. Here are the kings who reigned over Judah. Notice that Judah was a nation for basically an extra 150 years. Israel goes into exile in 722 BC. Judah goes into exile in 605, 596, and 587. There are multiple stages to their exile. But notice that they had the same number of leaders. And that's an important point. This nation, it's very chaotic. And notice some of the length of leading, like 1 year, 4 years. So notice by the time 880 comes around, they've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 leaders. And 6 leaders reigning. Now notice 880, like they've only had 3 leaders reigning. So notice the chaos that's happening here. And also notice each of these children are all sons of David. So basically, Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, Abijam is the son of Rehoboam, so on. And it's not until you get down here, really Zedekiah and Jehoiakim are brothers. So this man, and this man are all sons of Josiah. But notice these are all just generational. It's so much smoother. But here it's very, very different. Baasha is not a son of Nadab. He's a usurper, as is Zimri, as is Omri, as is Jehu, as is all of these people. There's so many usurpers happening here. And it's just a picture of faithfulness to God leads to this stability and even this national stability, where here this faithlessness to God leads to chaos and death and destruction for the people. I mean, in 722, when God's people were exiled by the Assyrians, and I think that's on my next slide. Let's see here. No, not quite yet. The Assyrians were real rough dudes, and it just led to a lot of destruction. So at this point, we've talked about Jeroboam, so let's continue. Here we have Elijah and Elisha, who are really doing ministry, let's see here, at this time, from Ahab down to Jehoram. And it's interesting that we're getting information about them at this time, because this was a time where God's people were worshiping the Baals. So the golden calves were like this synchronistic worship, where Jeroboam attributed the works of God to calves. It was evil. But during the time of Ahab and his children, they started worshiping the Baals for a few reasons. One, because Ahab married Jezebel. Notice her name. He married a foreign woman who was a princess, a daughter of a priest of Baal. So she did a good job evangelizing the nation. Ahab did an awful job, and Jezebel did a great job. And the whole people started worshiping not just the golden calves, but also the Baals. And that's where we get Elijah's ministry. We get Elijah famously saying it's not going to rain on the land. And then at the word of the Lord it rains. And that's where we get Mount Carmel, this contest of Mount Carmel, where it's this beautiful picture where Elijah says, let's stop waffling between opinions. If Baal is God, let's serve him. If the Lord is God, let's serve him. So Elijah has this contest. And remember, it's a drought. There's no rain. And Elijah says, let's bring the prophets of Baal, and we'll let them offer a sacrifice to Baal. We'll put their offering on the altar, and we'll let them call out to Baal to come down and to consume the offering with fire. So we're not going to light it on fire. And I'll do the same to the Lord. And let's see which God answers. So he lets the prophets of Baal go first, and they start doing all kinds of stuff, all kinds of really evil worship. Notice what they do. They're cutting themselves. Think about that. Other religions, paganism in the ancient world, and I would say other religions as well outside of Christianity, are cruel. How is it, guys, that there would be a people who would think cutting themselves and hurting themselves would bring about a response from the divine? It's evil. And we see in Baal worship, we see not only the cutting and the hurting of one another, but we see a cult prostitute where basically there's sexual encounters between the priests and the cult prostitutes that somehow brings about the Baals to come down and enjoy it. I mean, this is when we decide what's right and wrong, we cast God in our image. And it's heinous and it's evil, guys. But notice what Elijah does. He doesn't cut himself. He doesn't do anything like that. He prays to God. And God comes down and consumes the offering. And Elijah says, like, let's worship God. And people say, the Lord, he is God. And they're all so excited and they want to be faithful to God. And then Jezebel says, I'm going to kill Elijah. And in such a human way, Elijah is afraid and he runs away. And when he's running away, he gets a commission to anoint Elisha, his successor, to be prophet. And these stories, as you read them this week, we see crazy, awesome miracles like multiplying grain, raising a widow's son, telling the rain to stop. Now, let's think about this. Baal, in Phoenician religions, Canaanite religions, was supposed to be the god of the rain. He was supposed to be the god of fertility. He was supposed to be the god of grain. So basically, if he's the god of fertility, and not only does he give people children, but he also makes the ground fertile. And guess what? At the command of God, there is no rain, and the ground is not fertile. And at the command of God, a widow's son is raised from the dead. What are these miracles functioning as? Even before and after Carmel, they're functioning an evangelistic purpose to say that Baal is not a god. The Lord is the true God. And let me just apply this, if you would let me, to modern society. Our generation is striving after happiness, and yet as their God, like whatever makes you happy, do it. Pursue happiness in any way you want. But friends, our generation is committing suicide at rates higher than any other generation. Our generation has more anxiety than any other generation. Our generation is not happy. And yet the Lord is showing us a pathway of blessings in knowing God, knowing that our sins can be forgiven because of Jesus, knowing that when we die, we will live because Jesus is alive, seeing in Scripture a pathway of loyalty to God and treating one another in truly human ways. Friends, let me just show you and invite you that just as the book of 1 Kings is an indictment on Baal and showing that he is a no God, let me implore you and encourage you that the pathway to in our society of worshiping happiness as the ultimate God, that we will do anything to make us happy, is bankrupt. It has no power. Do not live your life for it. Live your life for Jesus, the one who can truly satisfy you, who can make your condemnation go away, who can take your guilt and crush it at the cross, who can say that you will live because I live. Like the pathway to flourishing is in Christ. It's not in any other idol. Now, so we're seeing these narratives being constructed in a very important way. And let's just quickly talk about the exile the exile of God's people in 722. Again, this is the northern nation up here, is outlined here. And what we see is the reason is idolatry. They have been faithless to God. And because they've been faithless to God, they have been faithless to one another. When you read First Kings, you see constant examples of failed ethics and failed religion. The southern nation lasts a little bit longer, as we said, about 150 more years. And yet the key phrases we're seeing in the northern nation and the southern nation is that God's people are doing what's right in their own eyes. They're worshiping at high places. They are worshiping idols. And they are not treating one another in truly human ways. So the northern nation is exiled in 722. The southern nation is exiled for really the same reasons in 605, 597, and then their temple is finally destroyed either in 587 or 586, and then there's one final exile in 580. So again, this is the history of God's people as mapped out from Samuel and Kings. We'll talk about later in the semester about the same time period mapped out through Chronicles, but what we're seeing here is idolatry and faulty ethics leads to God's judgment, but God constantly appealing that his people would come back to him, that they would experience his mercy and his grace. So let's pick up in the latter prophets in our next lecture.